Good afternoon, everybody. That means you, Dean. Right. We're going to be stopping shortly now. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for coming back after your tea break. We're now moving on to agenda item number 12, and this is now the bill to reform the Archbishop's Electoral College and the Bishops' Electoral Colleges. Your papers for this section include the report of the Select Committee, and the report reproduces the bill, all proposed amendments and the explanatory memorandum. I do need to explain to you that under the bill procedure, the governing body has been informed by the Select Committee and the Standing Committee, September 2023 Standing Committee Report on Governance and Legal Matters, paragraph 1, to be precise, that they deem the bill to be non-controversial. Let's read that again. To be not be non-controversial. Therefore, the bill has been set down for a full in-person debate at this session of the governing body in accordance with section 29 of chapter 2 of the Constitution. So what we need to do first is we need to go into a committee stage to discuss the bill, and then we come on to the bill proper. So the first thing we need to now do is to appoint a chair to run the committee stage. And what I would like to do is propose that Andrew Keyser, KC, acts as committee chair, and I would like you to vote in favour of that. So please, could I have a show of in favour? Anybody against? Anybody abstaining? Okay, there was one against, yeah. So I will now hand over the chair to Andrew Keyser, and then after the committee stage, I will then resume the chair for the actual bill itself. Thank you.
Good. Well, we are now the committee rather than governing body as such. The role of the committee is to finalise the text of the bill so that it's in a form that can go back before governing body when it reconvenes in a few minutes, I hope, so that it can consider the bill. The standing orders don't apply, which, as I understand it, means that procedure is up to me. As we're concerned with the text of the bill that will be considered in due course, any speeches that might be made should please relate to the text of the bill that will fall for consideration by governing body, not to the merits of the bill itself. With that, I'll invite the chair of the Select Committee, Ms. Maura Randall, to introduce the Select Committee's report.
Thank you very much, Chair. With your permission, before I actually begin, I would personally like to thank the members of this particular Select Committee for their diligence and their considered discussion on the task that was set us. And certainly personal thanks from me. Members of governing body, you already have a copy of the Select Committee's report, and I trust that you've had an opportunity to read it. So you will be very pleased to know that I don't propose to read great swathes of it out to you. The Select Committee are aware that our work has been undertaken at a relatively late stage of what has been a long process. In recent years, there has been 3 reports from 2 working groups on these issues, as well as 2 very substantive governing body debates and much discussions at Standing Committee. The bill which eventually arose from these reports and debates contains proposals which have already been subject, as I said, to much deliberation and to scrutiny. Subsequently, this did greatly simplify our job as a select committee, as we obviously only had to deal with a relatively small number of amendments on very specific points in the bill. As you will see from your papers, there were 6 amendments considered by the Select Committee, of which we are recommending 5 for adoption by governing body here in committee. The Chair and I will be taking you through these one by one in due course. The bill itself, with the Select Committee's regulations recommendations inserted, is published at Appendix 1 of the report, starting at page 8. The changes to the Constitution of the Church in Wales proposed are in the 2 schedules to the bill, which also start at the bottom of page 8. For your information, where the text is highlighted in yellow, these are the amendments to the bill proposed by the Select Committee. Where text is shown in coloured track changes, but not highlighted, these are amendments to the Constitution proposed by the original bill, but have been left unchanged by the Select Committee. Excuse me. Before we go through the proposed amendments to the bill one by one, I just want to say a few words about pages 5 and 6 of the report, which are matters on which the Select Committee had discussions but did not propose any amendments. There was one part of the revised Electoral College process with which some members of the Select Committee remain uncomfortable. Everybody we have spoken to is concerned that the process is equitable, fair, and kind to all potential electees. Some of us are worried that there may be an unfairness where some candidates are members of the Electoral College and some are not. Candidates who are present throughout a college will be able to have conversations with other electors, whether inside the college itself or on the fringes, possibly to clarify or correct something that has been said about them, or indeed add. Obviously, candidates who are not present do not have that same opportunity. Now, the earlier working group suggested that any shortlisted candidate should be excluded from the college. The proposals before us today do not do this, although it would be open to the college itself to agree to implement such a rule. So we do not propose an amendment, but we do hope that each and every electoral college will carefully consider this point when agreeing their rules. That's all I wish to say, Chair, at this stage. But with your permission, I would be happy to take the committee through each of the 5 amendments recommended by the Select Committee for adoption.
Yes, thank you. What we'll do is go through the 5 proposed amendments that have been recommended by the Select Committee in turn. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. And having dealt with those, we shall turn to proposed amendment 5, which was not recommended by the Select Committee. So please begin.
Thank you. The amendments proposed by the Select Committee to the bill, debated upon and to be voted upon. The motions are as follows. Proposed Amendment 1 is proposed by the Select Committee on the advice from the Standing Committee and the RB Legal Department, and it can be seen on page 2 of our report. As we are aware, there is currently one vacant bishopric, St David's, and the electoral college process to fill that vacancy is well underway. The proposed amendment makes clear that the St David's Electoral College should proceed on the current rules rather than any new rules. And this is obviously because the process is already underway. If this bill passes today, then we recommend that all future colleges after the St David's College next month will proceed under the new rules of governance. So, Chair, I move that the bill be amended in accordance with proposed Amendment 1.
Thank you. So we have the first motion, which is that there be inserted a new clause into the bill as follows, that these amendments to the Constitution shall not apply to the Electoral College to fill a seat already vacant at the date of promulgation, but shall otherwise come into force with immediate effect. Does anyone wish to speak to that motion?
As backer of the bill, I'm in full support of the amendment, and we're very grateful to the Select Committee for actually spotting something that we hadn't.
Does anyone else wish to speak? In that case, do you wish to respond to Archdeacon McNess?
Other than thanks for his vote, no, sir.
In that case, can we please vote on proposed Amendment 1, which is by simple show of hands with the voting cards. Will those in favour please show? Thank you. Will those against show? Any abstentions? One abstention. Thank you.
The second amendment the Select Committee recommends is under Schedule 1 of the bill, and that is an amendment to Section 6 of Chapter 5. To save time on this, I will actually speak, if I may, Chair, on amendments 2 and 3 together, if I may, though they will be moved separately. Both can be found, Chair, on page 3 of the report. So proposed amendments 2 and 3 were proposed by the Reverend Richard Wood and would require each Archbishop's College and each Bishop's College to publish their agreed procedural rules to the governing body. Proposed Amendment 2 relates to the Archbishop's Colleges, and proposed Amendment 3 does exactly the same to the Bishop's College. The Select Committee thought that this was a very good idea to implement transparency of the process and allow governing body appropriate monitoring and oversight of the operations of the college without obviously straying into confidential matters. So, Chair, I move that the bill be amended in accordance with proposed Amendment 2, please.
Thank you. So the proposed amendment is that Section 6 of Chapter 5 of the Constitution be amended by the addition at the end of the words, "A copy of the rules under which an election was made shall be published to members of governing body at their first meeting following the election." Does anyone wish to speak to that motion? In that case, we'll proceed to the vote. Those in favour? Thank you. Those against? None. Any abstentions? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So following on from that, I now move that the bill be amended in accordance with proposed Amendment 3.
Thank you. And that is the motion that Section 11 of Chapter 5 be amended by the addition at the end of the section of identical words, namely a copy of the rules under which an election was made shall be published to members of governing body at their first meeting following the confirmation of the election by the bench of bishops assembled in synod. So nearly identical words. Does anyone wish to speak to that? In that case, we'll vote. Those in favour? Thank you. Those against? Any abstentions? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. If I may
Yes,
now...
and it's being pointed out to me that the slides haven't been moved on. I think we're moving now to proposed amendment 4. Yes, thank you.
Chair, with your permission, I would like to speak to proposed amendments 4 and 6 together. Proposed amendment 5, as you will see in your documents, is not recommended by the Select Committee. And once we have considered the proposed amendments of 4 and proposed amendment 6, I understand that the Reverend Richard Wood will be given the opportunity to propose Amendment 5 to vote of this committee. So, proposed Amendment 4 you will find at the bottom of page 3 of your report. And proposed Amendment 6 is on, I believe, page 5 of the report. There is, Chair, typographical error on page 5, which the Secretariat offers its apologies. The amendments, as you will see it, in proposed Amendment 6, is to Regulation 20.2, not 8.2 that appears. But I can assure you that this is correct in the bill itself. These two amendments, Amendments 4 and 6, clarify that the preliminary meetings of the Electoral College are held in private, which the Constitution already makes clear in respect of the main college meeting. This has always been the intention, and the Select Committee feel that making this explicit is a very helpful amendment. Proposed Amendment 4 makes this clear for the Archbishop's College, and proposed Amendment 6 for bishops' colleges. So, Chair, if I may, I move that the bill be amended in accordance with proposed Amendment 4.
Can we go back one slide, please? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So the motion is that Regulation 8.2 of Chapter 5 regulations be amended by the addition at the end of the words such meeting, brackets S, close brackets, shall be private. Does anyone wish to speak to that? Yes. And if anyone else wishes to speak, please come forward now.
Sorry, Richard Mulcahy, Monmouth. The other word, co-opted. Very briefly, this is a question more than a change, but the meaning of the word private. Is private defined within the rest of the Constitution? Is that the word we use when we close the electoral colleges to outsiders? I just don't feel it's actually a precise term. Do we talk about not in public? Do we talk about behind closed doors? I would rather like to, admittedly I'm not a lawyer, otherwise I know the answer, but I'd just like that to clarify.
Chris Dearden, lay elector, lay clerk, Bangor. Just really wanted to draw attention to the word physical there. It presupposes that the meetings, the preparatory meetings, will be held electronically over Zoom or Teams or whatever, which has, if I'm allowed to say that without breaking any confidence, been the case hitherto. I just wondered if the reference to the physical meeting might actually just stop the college from meeting in person at the preparatory stage if they wanted to do so. Thinking as to the last preparatory meeting that Electoral College had, in practice, most people seem to be in St David's anyway. There's a reference to main meeting in the terminology elsewhere in the paperwork. I just wondered whether it was worth adopting that instead of physical. And I do feel rather embarrassed at making such an anal point, but I'll leave it with you.
Thank you. Well, however else one may describe it, it doesn't relate to the proposed amendment, so it has no bearing on the motion. Does anyone else wish to speak? Just by way of information, that the expression private is normally used as meaning not in public when it comes to meetings or hearings. But anyway, that's the motion. So we'll take a vote on it. Those in favour? Those against? Any abstentions? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Amendment 6 relates to the bishops' colleges. Exactly the same, that meetings shall be in private, preliminary meetings. So, Chair, if I may, I move that the bill be amended in accordance with proposed Amendment 6.
Thank you. So the motion is that Regulation 20.2 of Chapter 5 Regulations be amended by the addition at the end of the words, such meeting, brackets, S, close brackets, shall be private. Does anyone wish to speak on that? In that case, we'll take a vote. Those in favour, please. Thank you. Those against? Any abstentions? Thank you. That concludes the Select Committee's proposals. Thank you very much indeed. We now turn to proposed Amendment 5, and I invite the Reverend Richard Wood to speak to that and to move it.
Thank you, Chair. Richard Wood, elected cleric, Bangor. Apologies for keeping you in committee. A matter of principle more than practicalities, but it has practical implications, as the Select Committee note. The principle by which I propose this amendment is that I believe bishops should be called out from amongst the church by the church. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, we read that whoever aspires to be an overseer, perhaps we can read bishop there, aspires to a noble task. Noble, that's good. So I don't speak against aspiration to being a bishop in the church in Wales, although you might need to ask questions about those who do aspire to that. What Paul doesn't go on to do, as he writes that, is to describe how someone should be able to write an application, but rather he outlines personal qualities and God-given gifts, which the church should be able to identify amongst itself. It should be able to identify those who have been given these qualities and to discern whether or not they have been given in order for that person to serve as a bishop. So candidates for consideration by the Electoral College should, I believe, be identified from within the church by the church, and that's resolved by a process of nomination, not application. So what difference practically? Well, this wouldn't exclude those who would seek to apply under the bill as it stands. However, those who would be willing to be nominated but not willing to apply would be excluded by the current bill. There are two objections to my proposed amendment made by the Select Committee. Firstly, that we would not get the necessary background information or all the information we need from nominated candidates, to which I ask, why not? Simply require from nominators exactly the same information as we would from those we ask to be applicants. Use the same form, change the wording. We would need people to support applicants. Well, those are nominators. Secondly, the objection is that there would be a deluge of nominations. I find this unlikely, but were it to be so, it would rather open up a pool of candidates which would otherwise not perhaps come to the mind of the Electoral College. And this is what perhaps the preliminary committee is there to do. It would look at all the nominations and make a shortlist. I don't think that's too onerous a task. So this is a matter of principle. Practicalities are there, and I believe they can be overcome. Therefore, I move the amendment.
Thank you. Before we proceed to open the matter up to the floor and to the vote, I'll invite Maura Randall to respond on behalf of the Select Committee.
Thank you, Chair. As I've already noted, the Select Committee did not recommend this proposed Amendment 6 for adoption. The Select Committee was unanimous in its view, and its reasons are clearly set out for you on pages 4 and 5 of the report. In essence, the Select Committee was of the view that this process for determining who is a potential candidate, who is a nominated candidate, and what it means for the process is a matter for the elected representatives of the Electoral College to decide. This amendment, as drafted, does not explain the practical upshot of what it would mean to be a nominated candidate. It could potentially lead to a very large number of nominated candidates and turning this into a very unmanageable shortlist. And it could subsequently take a significant proportion of the college's time. The committee feels that a provision such as this, if it is the will of the college, should be incorporated into the college's rules and not the Constitution. My response, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to speak on this proposed amendment?
Paul McNess, nominated Archdeacon St David's. As the backer of the bill, I've been in favour of the 5 proposals that were brought by the Select Committee. This one, I'm afraid, I oppose on grounds of practicalities more than anything else. We need to properly define what a communicant member of the Church in Wales is first as well. That's quite an interesting one to try and determine as to how that is defined. I also think that the whole purpose of having an electoral college to elect bishops is that you elect a group of people whose responsibility is to make the nomination and the election of a new bishop. One of the things we're being very careful at the moment with the current electoral college preparations for the St David's election is about the use of the word nominate. There was perhaps some confusion in some parties at the last electoral college where people reading the Church Times advert may have got the impression that by submitting a name to the email address, they were automatically putting somebody into the nomination system. The current rules state that only the electoral college, the electors, can nominate a candidate once the electoral college is called into session, following a number of other processes first, namely an oath of confidentiality. There is no reason why anybody in the Church in Wales can't suggest to any elector a potential name for somebody that could go forward to be a candidate nominated by an elector in an electoral college. And usually, the current way of doing things is that if somebody is a potential candidate, note the word potential, not a definite candidate, then they are usually asked to complete paperwork, which at the last electoral college was circulated to all members of the electoral college, so we all had the information in advance to look at, but once already signing an oath of confidentiality in regards to the documentation. This amendment doesn't give any of the practicalities, the technicalities, or the rules under which this would be done. And so I oppose this on the grounds that whilst I have sympathy with the principle behind it, I don't think the amendment as it stands is practicable to be implemented.
Thank you.
Your Grace, governing body, Mark Thomas, cleric, Swansea and Brecon. I certainly agree with the need for certain clarifications of language and consistency of process, but I strongly support the amendment. King David didn't even make the shortlist when the nominations for the Lord's Anointed were left to Jesse and his immediate council. And I would contend that the Electoral College is primarily entrusted with the discernment and identification of the best candidates from all reasonable nominations. But for the college to have exclusive right to nominations is, to my mind, to exclude potentially excellent candidates to be our future bishops. So I strongly support the amendment.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to speak?
Anna Wilkinson, lay member St David's. I'm not absolutely sure how the Electoral College would cope if 100 people filled in application forms, because they end up with exactly the same problem of too many people to shortlist, or apparently too many people to shortlist. The other thing is, I'm not entirely sure how well publicised the membership of the Electoral College is to sort of give names to them, if you're working on the principle of the Electoral College should consider it. And so what I'm really saying is I think a bit more clarification is required before one can really properly consider the amendment. Although I'm actually probably supportive of it on the grounds that if somebody's filled in an application form, I'm not entirely sure that they're not actually excluding themselves by doing so, because they're saying, I want this job, God, rather than God saying, I think you ought to be considered for the job. So I'm a bit confused at the moment. Thank you.
Richard Mulcahy, Monmouth. I apologise to Richard Wood in that I am going to speak against the amendment, but agree with him on just about everything he said. In reality, this is not a church where there is a huge amount of active democracy. We are all elected through our diocesan conferences, but exactly who is on the conference and who elects people to it and so on. I think that there is every opportunity to say if people who are nominated by communicant members who are on the electoral roll of the Church in Wales or whatever, and we could say perhaps a dozen nominees. I think 2 was perhaps pushing it, Richard. But you know, if we had a dozen nominators, we could put names forward for consideration by the Electoral College. I have no idea how the college works in its confidentiality and privacy. All I know is that names come in and a name comes out at the end. I see no reason why that can't be made a little more transparent, with the opportunity for members of the Church in Wales to put names forward in a straightforward and structured way. So while I have to vote against this amendment because it can't work like this, I think the principle is something that we should be thinking of. I know nobody will want to go back to electoral colleges after we've just done it again. But the fact is, why not allow people to nominate? I haven't heard an argument that says, why not? Diolch.
Heather Payne, lay elected Llandaff, and I'm also an elector for Llandaff. And I can tell you, I've sat through some pretty hideous electoral colleges, given a system which does not encourage front-loading of information. The reason why I totally respect what Reverend Richard Wood is saying in this amendment, but disagree with it, is because the system that we have must allow those who've been elected as electors to share in the discernment of the Holy Spirit. And doing that with as much reasonable information as possible on important matters that people have got in terms of experience, in terms of their prayer life, their what they've actually done in the past. It is really important to have that available. Otherwise, we are dealing with hearsay, gossip, and potentially worse. So the system has been carefully designed in order to try and make sure that we make it work, but not closing anybody off to the work of the Holy Spirit. And so I also would vote against this amendment. Thank you.
Yes, anyone else?
Adam Paulison, ASAF elected. It gets me, the word nomination gets me thinking of, it seems to be a better way or a better wording than the word applicant, I think, to help us to understand the idea of calling. You know, I think of Augustine, the story of Augustine being reluctantly dragged forward to his consecration. And, or other examples that I think of my own calling, in that if I hadn't have been approached and asked to consider my current post, I would not have dreamed of applying for that post. And it wasn't until I was convinced that it wasn't until I wasn't convinced to take on my current post until I realised that I had the sort of backing of the support of my bishop, my archdeacon, the sort of the bishop's staff team, and it was a coincidence that happened literally the day before I was due to give my answer to Bishop Gregory about my current post, whereby somebody was telling me their story about how their bishop's staff team had discerned their calling for them, and that actually, Adam, sometimes you should listen to the bishops, and that they can get these things right. And that gave me confidence that I could trust the bishop's discernment. I say, we can laugh about that. But I wonder if this idea of still keeping this tradition of nominating candidates to the Electoral College keeps that, because there could be candidates who somebody will go to them and they will say, have you thought about applying to become a bishop? No. And it could be a confidence thing, perhaps. But somebody else, if you've got two people who are nominating them, that gives that person confidence to come forward for their position. Or if the whole Electoral College then goes back to that person and says, will you apply for this post? Or will you be considered for this post? And that's going to make that person who's being put forward for this to stand as bishop, it's going to give them more confidence to stand for something that they would never even dreamed of perhaps applying for too. This word nomination, it keeps the essence of calling, I think. And I think I'm going to support the motion on that basis, as long as I've understood everything correctly, of course. Thank you.
Good, thank you.
Peter Ratcliffe, St David's, elected. We've been told all the time that the voice of everyone in the Church in Wales is important. We've just had this discussion about the priorities for the Church in Wales, all of us involved. And in supporting this amendment, it involves the whole church, not just the Electoral College, in the process, which I think is the biblical way, actually, of going about things. It means bishops are discerned not just by an Electoral College of 40 or so, it's the whole Church of God. It's more inclusive. The objections I've heard are to the paperwork. Perhaps you could put in a proviso that the paperwork for everyone needs to be in, say, 2 months in advance. I'm not prescriptive about that, so that that objection can be dealt with actually in the process, and also nominating by people that you trust is important. I suppose I'll give my own call to ordination. I wouldn't have gone for it unless people had said, have you considered this call, Peter? And it does exclude people if this amendment, I think, is not accepted. So I support this amendment.
Chair, Rod Green, nominated Archdeacon Llandaff and second backer of the bill. Whilst I agree with much of what Richard says, I oppose the amendment on the grounds that there's already scope for the Electoral College to itself determine how nominations are processed. So there's not really any need to add it to the Constitution, and I think we want to maintain the freedom of the College to do its work. So the principle is a good one, but the amendment isn't required, so I oppose the amendment.
Thank you. Before I invite the Reverend Richard Wood to respond if he wishes, does anyone else wish to speak? No? Good, thank you.
Apologies very quickly, Richard Wood, elected Bangor. I don't spend my evenings reading the Constitution, but I think communicant member is language that we use elsewhere in the Constitution. So I think clarity about that term is fine. Just also to say, in the bill as it is before us, it leaves room for the Electoral College to make up its own rules about how it conducts the process. That is there, it should be there. All the questions that are being asked about this amendment could easily be asked about the rules that the Electoral College will apply for application. And we will be seeing what they are after each Electoral College, because we've passed that amendment, hopefully. And we might be wanting to ask those very same questions about that. What this simply seeks to do is to enshrine within the Constitution that one singular restriction on the Electoral College, which is that they formulate some method of nomination rather than application. Thank you.
Thank you. The motion, therefore, is that the bill be amended first by the insertion of a new Regulation 17, reading, the Electoral College shall receive, this is in Chapter 5 Regulations. Regulation 17, the Electoral College shall receive nominations of candidates from any two communicant members of the Church in Wales, and that subsequent regulations be renumbered accordingly. So would those in favour please show? We'll do a physical count, so if you'd keep your hands raised. Good, thank you. Those against? Thank you. Any abstentions? Thank you. So the votes.
John.
Yes. The votes for the motion, 24, against 70, and abstentions 5, so the motion is lost. That concludes the amendments that have been notified. Any member may move an amendment so long as it is in the opinion of the chair, that is, in my opinion, consequential upon one of the amendments which the committee has made to the bill in this session. Does anyone wish to move such a consequential amendment? No? Any other amendments may only be moved with the special leave of the chair. Does anyone wish to move any non-consequential or even inconsequential amendment? No. Then, that being the case, I shall now report the bill to the governing body. I report that the committee of the governing body has met and considered the bill to reform the Archbishop's Electoral College and the Bishops' Electoral Colleges. The committee has made amendments to the text and now presents the bill as so amended for final consideration by governing body.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we are now back as governing body, and we will now look at the bill to reform the Archbishop's Electoral College and the Bishops' Electoral Colleges. And I would now like to hand across to the Venerable Paul McNess, who is the backer or proposer of the bill, to introduce the bill.
Chair, Your Grace, members of the governing body, Paul McNess, nominated Archdeacon, Diocese of St David's. One of our faults as human beings is our propensity to concentrate on the negative. We are much more vocal about failure than success. This has been the case with the electoral college system in the Church in Wales. For the vast majority of the life, though, of the Church in Wales, since disestablishment, it has served the Church in Wales well in electing bishops who have led the Church in faith and humility. Of course, up until relatively recently, the Church in Wales, if the electoral college failed to elect a bishop, was obliged under the Constitution to defer to the Archbishop of Canterbury to appoint a bishop to the vacant see. This was changed to the decision that being that of the bench of Welsh bishops. It is interesting to note that the system never failed to elect when the threat of Canterbury was hanging over the head of our independent Welsh province. The college has failed in the last 20 years to elect 3 times. Bangor in 2004, Llandaff in 2017, and Swansea and Brecon in 2021. Unfortunately, the adverse publicity and the leaking of the proceedings of the Llandaff College in question did absolutely nothing to inspire confidence in the system. It is not only the custom, but a provision of the Constitution that those who take part in electoral colleges, as either electors or staff, are required to be bound by an oath of confidentiality for life as to candidates and voting. And whilst the vast majority of electors have held the oath as binding and sacrosanct, there have been members who have spoken about proceedings to others, and over the years some have sadly even made this public. It is the failure of the electors to come to a common mind that has caused the failure of colleges. It doesn't mean that the electoral college system is broken or irreparable. As the system depends upon human beings, there will always be a potential problem, as we are all flawed as a result of the fall. The need for electors to have hearts and minds that are open to the prompting of the Holy Spirit is vital if the college is to carry out its work and achieve its prayerful purpose. Whilst it is inevitable that some electors may come with ideas of who they believe should be the right person for the vacant see, it is important that no elector is so wedded to a name that they are not prepared to be persuaded of the better candidacy of someone else. With this as an introduction to the Electoral College and recent history, why the need for reform and why this bill? Although the college has served well, anyone who has taken part in one of the colleges will tell you that it is not perfect. And as the church moves into the future, we are all conscious of the need for appropriate and safe methods of recruitment and appointment. There are a number of practices and procedures which the Electoral College is required to do before any discernment of candidates can take place. This is predominantly in each college setting its own rules, which by convention have usually been by looking at those of the previous college. The college can only agree the rules when it is in session, duly constituted following the oath. This, of course, means that much of the first of 3 days is taken up in administrative procedures, as it is also the custom for the vacant diocese to present its current needs, usually based upon a profile, to the college. The purpose of this bill is not to place a straitjacket on the Electoral College by tying it up in procedural red tape, which I know sounds really strange coming from me. Each college is different and may require different approaches and processes for electors. The majority of recommendations from the Electoral College Reform Working Group, which weren't originally part of this bill, have been backed by you and by us who are proposing and seconding. And they affirm the commendation of best practice, as they suggest. I am certain that electors will be mindful of these rules for each and every college moving forward. In recent years, the Archbishop or Senior Bishop has called together electors online for an informal meeting to start at least to begin discussion and drafting of rules for the forthcoming college. This bill seeks to formalise these informal meetings by placing them into the Constitution as one or more preparatory meetings. This will formally allow the college to have a set of rules agreed in principle prior to the convening of the college, hopefully saving administrative time at the actual college and giving more time for prayerful discernment. Many of the amendments proposed in this bill relate to giving greater clarity to the regulations, as well as trying to deal with issues of inclusive language, and as well as placing more realistic timeframes for the calling of electoral colleges. Whilst none of us would want the election process to take as long as the appointment system in the Church of England, it is more realistic and will allow preparatory work both for the college and the diocesan profile, more time and less haste. Another area that this bill wishes to bring change is the ability of the president of the college to pass the chair to others. This makes obvious sense in regard to the Archiepiscopal College, where they would be a potential candidate, but equally with an episcopal election, should the president be nominated, resulting in a possible translation in diocese, they would not be able to chair the college, and so this therefore formalises current practice. Perhaps the most controversial change that is proposed as a result of this bill is to insert the possibility of the calling of a second college if the first one fails to elect. The first college would have the ability to vote as to whether a second college should be called or whether it should be passed to the bench of bishops. The ability to hold a second college means that there would be a second chance to have an election rather than an appointment by the bench. I also know from comments made privately and publicly that the bench would prefer that any vacancy in C is filled by election. We are conscious that this might mean that the members of the second college might be slightly different to the first due to the ability of members to take time away from work or ministry, but that could equally be an advantage. Of course, the desire of most of us would be that any bishop would be elected at the first college called for that vacancy. And the calling of the second college is not a given in the bill, it is the choice of the electors. I therefore have pleasure in proposing this bill, which is a soft-touch approach to reform and hopefully will allow greater freedom and more prayerful time for discernment and discussion of candidates. My colleague, the Archdeacon of Llandaff, will now second and make further comment.
Thank you, Archdeacon Paul. Rod Green, nominated Archdeacon Llandaff, second backer of the bill. Whilst I am not quite so positive about the history and workings of the Electoral College as my esteemed colleague, I am very positive indeed about the process we have taken to get to this stage. The bill before you was presented to the Standing Committee in February this year following presentations from 2 different working groups. You might remember we didn't get it right first time around. GB made that very clear. So wisely we went away and had another go. The introduction of the bill was timed to coincide with the presentation of the report from the latest working group, providing time for debate and opportunity for submissions to the Select Committee afterwards. It was warmly welcomed with a good, positive debate, and there have been a number of helpful amendments incorporated into the bill as we agree today. We trialled some of the proposals at an actual electoral college. We learned from that experience what worked, what didn't, and that experience has also been incorporated into the bill before you. We finished that process this afternoon with the committee stage, which has again been vigorous and thorough. So it has been a full, thorough, and collaborative process, and I think the bill reflects that and is better for it. It keeps things simple, but it creates the constitutional framework that gives the Electoral College the best chance to effectively discern what the Spirit is saying to the churches, implementing the recommendations of the working group while preserving the sovereignty of the Electoral College. I am therefore more than happy to second this Electoral College reform bill and commend it for your approval. Thank you.
So my thanks go to both the Venerable Paul McNess and also the Venerable Rod Green for proposing and seconding the bill. And the bill is now open to debate. And I will take anybody who is wanting to speak to the debate or to the motion. If I can remind you when you come up, if you can just remember to introduce yourself, say where you're from, and if you want to speak in Welsh, please do.
Tony Mullins, Llandaff, elected. I worked as a social worker in a hospital for a number of years, and confidentiality was the word. It was absolutely the word. And I always told people, I can keep a secret. It's the people I tell can't. But I lived through the appointment of Bishop Jew and the Electoral College leading up to that, and I was alarmed looking at the news. I was ashamed, and all I want to say, I'm totally in support of the bill and will be voting accordingly, is that anybody who has an intention of putting themselves forward for an election to the Electoral College, you have to 100% keep that confidentiality. You have to swear that secret. I know it's a bit like the Masonic order, but there is a reason. And it's vital that we hold that as God would want us to. That we hold it in our hearts to keep what goes on, as they say, on tour, stays on tour. So I support the bill and I commend it.
Thank you. Does anybody else wish to speak to the bill? No? Well, if not, what I suggest we then do is we move on to the vote then in favour or against the bill. And this vote will be taken in orders, and we will do each order in separately. And what I would ask you to do is please keep your cards up until the vote is taken by the tellers, and then I'll ask you to put them down and we'll move on to the next order. So if I could ask first of all for those in the laity whether or not that the bill should be passed. Those in favour, please show your cards now. I'll now ask the laity, those who wish to vote against the bill, to please show your cards. And in the order of laity, again, if anybody wishes to abstain. No? Okay. So we'll now move on. And what I should have said as well, there needs to be a two-thirds majority for the bill to pass as well. So we'll now move on to the House of Clergy. So if I could ask the House of Clergy, for those in favour that the bill be passed, please put your cards up now. Thank you very much. Could I now ask the House of Clergy, those against the motion, to please show your cards? And then finally, in the House of Clergy, if there are any abstentions that the bill be passed, please hold your cards, show your cards. So while the tellers, thank you very much. So while the tellers now calculate the total number of the votes, they will then share those with me and I will share those with you, and then we will publish those to the bishops to decide whether or not they wish to withdraw ahead of them being asked to vote. Okay, so I will just publish the vote then of the two houses then for, I will start with the House of Laity. Those for the motion were 54, those against 1 with 0 abstentions. For the House of Clergy it was 36 for, 0 against, 3 abstentions. So I'll now ask the House of Bishops whether or not you wish to withdraw prior to being asked to vote. Okay, so if I could now, if you're not wishing to exercise your vote to withdraw, or your desire to withdraw, I'll just ask the House of Bishops if first of all you can vote to show whether you are for that the bill be passed. The House of Bishops show those against and any abstentions. No. So So the vote from the House of Bishops were 5 for, 0 against and 0 abstentions. So I will now pass over to the President of the governing body to promulgate the bill.
It's our custom to stand. I hereby promulgate this bill as a canon of the Church in Wales, and it shall henceforth be a law of the Church in Wales and binding on all members thereof. Thank you. Please do be seated. Chair,
Thank you very much. So we now move on to agenda item number 13, and this is an amendment to Chapter 5, Regulations, Electoral College by-elections. By way of introduction, in accordance with sections 35(9) and 10 of Chapter 2 of the Constitution, the Bishop of St Asaph has tabled the following motion to amend regulations passed by the Standing Committee in February 2023. Paragraphs 20 and 21 of the Standing Committee's report on governance and legal matters gives background. In Chapter 5 regulations, renumber Regulation 4.5 as 4.6 and insert 4.5, a diocesan conference may make provision to delegate elections to fill casual vacancies on the list of episcopal electors and the supplemental list to its Standing Committee. Such elections shall otherwise proceed as set out in Regulation 4.4. By way of background, earlier this year, the Standing Committee used its powers in Section 35 of Chapter 2 of the Constitution to introduce a provision allowing casual vacancies on the Electoral College to be filled by a diocesan conference, either at a meeting or by electronic means. Previously, there had been no clear mechanism for casual vacancies to be filled in the middle of a triennium, leading to some dioceses being underrepresented at particular electoral college. The amendment to the Constitution passed in February and reported to the governing body in April makes clear that a by-election may be held in such cases and sets out the procedure for doing so. Under Section 35 procedure, one bishop or 10 members can table an amendment to a constitutional change approved by the Standing Committee. The Bishop of St Asaph has tabled this amendment in accordance with this procedure. The purpose of this amendment would allow a diocesan conference to delegate by-elections to its Standing Committee so that members of the Standing Committee become the electorate for that by-election. The proposer is the Bishop of St Asaph. There's no requirement for a seconder, so I will ask the Bishop of St Asaph to open the debate.
Gregory Cameron, Bishop of St Asaph, ex officio. Well, dear friends, you're probably ready for prayers and tea, and so I apologise for delaying you for a little longer in what I hope will be something relatively uncontroversial. They say that open confession is good for the soul, and on this occasion I have to confess to you all that the Diocesan Conference of St Asaph has probably been a little bit too clever for its own good. And that is because in 2017, we adopted a new diocesan constitution, and we noted the need to fill casual vacancies from time to time on all sorts of bodies, including the Electoral College. And the decision was taken by our diocesan conference at that time that they were happy to delegate all casual vacancies, not the main elections, only casual vacancies, to the diocesan standing committee to fill the gaps until the next election took place. And things bubbled on for 6 years, all very happily, until the amendment was proposed in April at governing body. And when I consulted the legal beagles of the Church in Wales, they told me that the old process, the 2017 process, was probably illegal, but after the passing of the amendment was certainly illegal. Now, our feeling in St. Asaph is that it's quite a good system that works for us. And that is that should there be a casual vacancy, the standing committee can elect until there is another full election. And so I'd like to crave the indulgence of governing body. No diocese has to adopt this method, but we would like to make the provision for St. Asaph to be able to adopt this method as we find it works and is efficient. And that's all this is about. And so I beg to move the motion.
Thank you, Bishop Gregory. So the floor is open to debate the motion that Bishop Gregory has just put before us.
Good afternoon, Hannah Rowan, Monmouth Diocese, co-opted member. I am going to respectfully disagree with my colleague in saying that I don't necessarily think that this is uncontroversial, and I'm just going to explain why I think that briefly. We've just spent a long time talking about how much trust we put in our electoral college. The way that we run our process is that we choose our electors and then they choose on behalf of us. And what we're talking about here is a step back from that. We're asking, how do we choose our electors? And we know what happens usually. They're selected democratically, but this is talking about provision for when we've got a gap. There is real value, and I think we've heard that from around the room, in collective discernment of important appointments and positions of authority and influence, such as those exercised by the bench, matter very much. The way that vacancies and elections work, you might be on electoral college for several years and never have to take part, or you might suddenly have to take part in electing 3 bishops. We don't know, depending on how the vacancies arise. And it's very, very important that as many voices as possible are heard through that process. And in a sense, our way of being involved in that is, as diocese, choosing who we would like to put forward as electors. We have colleagues on standing committee that do hugely, hugely important work for us and already have a great deal of influence in our diocese, and we thank them for everything that they do. But if we delegate this to standing committee, we are giving a lot more power and influence to a small group of people, whereas it belongs to the diocese as a whole. On a practical note, we have made such strides forward in terms of our electronic capability recently, so it is absolutely possible to convene an extraordinary diocesan conference meeting with one item. So you would put it in the diary, everyone could come electronically, and what you would be there to do would be to vote on this one thing, we have that option available to us, so it is practically possible to do. And while I read the recommendation that said that this would not have any negative impact on the procedures of the Electoral College, I don't agree with that, and I think it could have a significant impact on the outcome of the Electoral College, depending on who's in the room as electors. So my plea would be, let's perhaps not give away our democracy too easily. Let's have a think. My view is that this isn't an appropriate amendment to make. Obviously, it's up to you to decide what you think. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jason Bray, elected St Asaph, Chair, Archbishop, members of the governing body. I'm an elected Vice President of the St Asaph Diocesan Standing Committee, and I'm actually going to speak in favour, although I acknowledge the arguments that were just made. This amendment is permissive rather than prescriptive. So the the St Asaph Diocesan Standing Committee is actually quite highly representative. We've got 2 members per mission area, so there are quite a lot of us in the room, and there are a whole lot of other people as well who sit on that committee. Now, I know other dioceses will have different structures and may be marginally less representative, but what this allows is each diocesan conference a degree of flexibility. As I said, that avoiding of calling the extraordinary meeting of the conference just to elect electors in the event of a casual vacancy. So, thank you.
Chair Conference, Mike Comore, elected Llandaff. Not necessarily a comment on the proposed amendment, but a question really to the legal beagles. Could we have an assurance that the possible illegality of what's happened in the past doesn't affect any validity of the elections that were conducted since 2017?
Yes, you can. Our process is that once an election is confirmed in Sacred Synod, then it is unchallengeable, and that's very clearly set out in the Constitution. So the time to have made that objection would have been prior to the Sacred Synod confirming an election, and there is no legal issue that arises.
Thank you. That's exactly what I thought you'd say.
Thank you very much. Andrew Lightbound, Monmouth Diocese and Newport Cathedral. I'm going to very gently, I hope, talk against what one of my soon-to-be chapter colleagues suggested. I don't see it as diminishing democracy, because the decision would have to be made for whether it could go to the Standing Committee by the Diocesan Conference. So it would be the Diocesan Conference having a series of options, or 2 options, placed in front of it, whether it wanted to give that authority to the Standing Committee or not. So the decision should be made at the Diocesan Conference and discussed at each Diocesan Conference, and it would allow the Diocesan Conference to decide what it thought the most expedient way forward was, and could of course be fully debated at that conference.
Before asking Bishop Gregory to respond to the comments that have been made, I'll just wait a couple of seconds just in case anybody else wishes to come to the podium. No. Bishop Gregory, would you like to respond?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll respond, if I may, only to Hannah's comments, because those seem to be the most pertinent. I think we'd all agree that we want to exercise as much democracy as we can within the life of the Church under God. What I'd say to balance what Hannah has said is that these are very remote possibilities. When we elect the Electoral College, we elect 6 laity and 6 clergy, most of whom will only be called upon if they're in the top 3 for an electoral college in a different diocese, and all 6 will only be called if it's their own diocese. But if that's not sufficient safeguard, we also elect a supplemental list of a further half a dozen, I think it is, members to fill any vacancies in the 6. And that any by-election to fill up casual vacancies are added at the bottom of that list. Therefore, you've got 12 candidates amongst the clergy, 12 candidates amongst the laity, all of whom will have been elected in the major election, and any casual vacancy that occurs is added to the very bottom of that list. So we're talking about a very remote possibility indeed, and I'd reflect what one of the speakers have said, surely it's in order to allow each diocesan conference to make the decision that it feels is right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bishop Gregory. So we'll move on then to the vote on this motion. And the motion before governing body is in Chapter 5 regulations to renumber the regulation 4.5 as 4.6 and insert 4.5. A diocesan conference may make provision to delegate elections to fill casual vacancies on the list of episcopal electors and the supplemental list to its standing committee. Such elections shall otherwise proceed as set out in Regulation 4.4. If I could ask first of all, please, for those in favour of the motion to show your cards.
Should we just see against, and then if it's close, we can call it out?
Yeah. I'm just going to ask for any against, and then we'll decide whether we actually need a count. So if I can ask for those against.
It's clearly carried.
Yeah. And finally, any abstentions? Thank you. I think that was clear. Well, I know that was clearly carried. So the vote was in favour of that motion. Thank you very much.